Hey Wargamers, City Games Workshop gave us an amazing preview of how terrain and cover is going to work in 10th edition 40k. And there's actually quite a bit of nuance and things to go through here. So overall, I think this is really cool. I think it hits the nail on the head in terms of achieving that simplified but not simple mantra that we've been hearing from Games Workshop, right? They want to streamline the game, make it faster, make it more intuitive, but not lose the fun, right? And this really does seem to present a very clean but effective set of rules for how terrain works. And terrain and cover in general has been one of those historically tricky, problematic mechanics for Warhammer. It's hard to get a good balance, and we've seen it swing from basically being absent in some editions to being way too complex, which I think is where we were at with 9th edition. And so one of the biggest takeaways from this preview is that keywords are gone. They said that there was more than 12,000 different possible combinations, 12,000 different terrain types that you could have in 9th edition. That's just way too much, right? And most people really, kind of reverted to just dealing with a couple different mechanics, a couple different terrain types, and not really exploring that complexity because it was just too much. So the fact that keywords from terrain are gone is a welcome reprieve, right? Cover only affects saves against shooting again. You're not dealing with close combat or anything like that. It's not modifying your to-hit rolls. All it does is give you a save against shooting attacks. So you don't have to go and remember keyword recipes. You don't have to have this cheat sheet to tell you what, this type of terrain does and that type of terrain does and all these wonky rules. It's just clean, and I love that. So the new benefit of cover rule says models can sometimes gain a measure of protection from terrain features. Each time a ranged attack is allocated to a model that has the benefit of cover, add 1 to the saving throw made for that attack, excluding invulnerable saves. Models with save characteristics of 3+ or better cannot have the benefit of cover against attacks with an armor penetration characteristic of 0. Multiple instances of the benefit of cover are not cumulative, right? And so that makes sense, right? It basically gives you +1 to your armor save. And it can never improve a save to a 2-up. That's one of the other big changes, is that you can never go from a 3-up to a 2-up. The wording here is a little awkward, but that's essentially what it does. You can still use cover to mitigate the AP of incoming shots. So if you're getting targeted by AP -1 and you're in cover, the cover can work, right? It can still have an effect there, but you can never get better than a 3-up save because of cover. And so that's cool. That means that you're not having those 3-up saves, those marine equivalents, hiding in cover, getting a 2-up save, and being just extremely hard to remove. That doesn't happen anymore. And that's particularly important because AP is broadly reduced. We've heard that they're toning down the AP of a lot of weapons in the game. And so there's probably going to be a lot more AP dash, a lot of AP -1 as opposed to 2, 3, or 4, or whatever, right? And so having this mechanic is really important for those new weapons that aren't going to be able to dislodge a 2-up save, but also avoids kind of the feel bads of that, right? If you're going from a 3-up save down to a 2-up, an AP dash weapon is being cut in half in terms of the total number of wounds that it can do. So this is a really clever mechanic. I think this is going to be huge for how the game plays and really smart of Games Workshop to build in this restriction. And overall, we see that terrain archetypes are returning, right? We don't have this keyword soup that we're dealing with. They're returning to the terrain archetypes of previous editions. So we have craters, which are basically area terrain. We have debris, which are small obstacles that you can't stand on. Hills, and like sealed buildings, so things that you can stand on or put other terrain on. Barricades, woods, ruins, those are all fairly intuitive things. So those are the, 6 different terrain archetypes that we have. And that's it. You just have to know what those 6 things do. Again, it's clean, it's smooth, it's intuitive, which is great. And each one of these things has a couple terrain-specific rules or restrictions that you need to keep in mind. But overall, it's just affecting which units benefit, what things actually happen. So it strikes a really nice balance between the extremes of previous editions where, again, we've had times where terrain has been extremely lackluster, and editions like 9th where there's just too much, right? And this just seems like a really happy medium. So I am psyched about this. So let's talk a little bit more about these specific terrain archetypes and what their rules are. So kind of the simplest version of terrain that they have in 10th edition is craters. Craters can give cover to infantry models that are wholly within or on top of the terrain, and that's it. So it's very simple, very basic, but there is something important to note here in that it is restricted to infantry, right? So if you're not infantry, you can't benefit from craters. That's basically how it's been, in the past too. So that's not surprising, but that does make it distinct from the debris terrain that we'll talk about in a moment. The other really important thing here, and probably the more important thing, is that in the wording of the rule, it specifies that it's models, not units, right? The unit doesn't have to be wholly within the terrain. The model does. And that is interesting because it suggests that hit, wound, allocation, saves, all of that is model by model in 10th edition. And so we're moving away from this whole unit type of mechanic that we've had in 8th and 9th and moving back into a more familiar mechanic of having things be model by model. And that makes a lot of sense because there's going to be a lot more mixed profile units in 10th, simply because of the leader mechanic, right? Like having leaders join units means that inherently you're going to have mixed profiles. And so that's going to be a common thing across factions. But, in 9th edition, that was relatively uncommon. Like having a crisis suit unit with drones was a little against the grain because you had those multiple profiles within a single unit. In 10th, that's going to be more common, and that's good, right? That we're returning back to that. I think the idea in 8th, 9th of having, just a single profile within the unit was trying to make things simple. I think it went too far in that direction. And so returning to that mixed unit or mixed profile unit approach makes sense and just works here. And so they're accommodating that by doing the model by model cover rules here as well. And so that really is an important takeaway, is that a lot of these mechanics are going to be looking model by model going forward, not at the unit scale. The next type of terrain that they previewed for us were barricades and pipes, or fuel pipes. And arguably, this is my least favorite type of terrain. It's always been a frustrating thing to play with. And, there aren't that many good options for it, right? Like there are tons of ruin kits and, trees that you can buy and things like that. Those are very accessible types of terrain. Pipes are less accessible within reason, right? Like you can go out and buy PVC and make your fuel pipes really easily if you want to, but it just, isn't the type of terrain that you see very often. And I think there's a reason for that. But in 10th edition, it maintains a lot of the functionality that it had in 9th, right? You have to be within 3 inches of that barricade or that fuel pipe to gain cover. But here it extends an engagement range to 2 inches if you're shooting or fighting across it, right? And so that facilitates charging. It means that all you have to do is get into contact with the barricade, just like in 9th. You have to get into contact with the barricade in order to complete your charge. If they are on the other side of that. So you can kind of ignore the physical barrier in a lot of cases, which is useful. It facilitates gameplay. But having an extended engagement range of 2 inches may not be sufficient to get across the barrier itself, right? If you have a really wide barricade, a really fat pipe, maybe you can't get across that with just 2 inches. Maybe 2 inches isn't enough. So that's going to be interesting. It will be dependent on the actual terrain. I'm sure if you're using the GW terrain, that's not a problem. But if you're using some 3D printed stuff or some homemade stuff, maybe that's not the case. And then there's also this kind of sweet spot, right? That you get the benefit of cover if you're within 3 inches of the barricade. But you still only have you still have engagement range being 2 inches. So if you are within 3 inches of the barricade, but more than 2 inches away from the far side of the barricade, you can get cover while still being outside of engagement range, which is interesting, right? I mean, that's a sweet spot, right? That's where you want to be, because then you can get the benefits with less of the drawback. So yeah, that's interesting. Again, this is one that you don't see that often in gameplay, but maybe you will with these streamlined rules. For debris and hills, they basically work the same. The only difference between them is that you can stand on a hill and you can't stand on debris. So if you can stand on it, it's a hill. If you can't, it's debris. That's really the only difference. They both have a very basic cover mechanism, kind of like craters, but it's not restricted to just infantry. So if the debris or hill blocks line of sight, at least partially, you get cover. It's that simple, which I like, right? And so that's cool, right? And that there's actually relevance of hills, and there's relevance of debris. That's just good to see, right? Especially battlefield debris has been not a particularly valuable piece of terrain. Like there's all sorts of, like knickknacks, doodads, whatever, things that are cool to look at on the tabletop that haven't had a very well-defined role. The fact that we have this here to really define what those things do in a very clear and concise way is great. I love that. And the fact that it benefits all units is really good, right? I mean, that makes those things much more universally appealing than it would be if they were restricted just to infantry or something else, right? So this suggests that, having some element of debris, having some element of, hills and stuff is going to be a more important part of the game than it has been in the past, right? It's not going to be all about ruins. It's not going to be all about, having the ruins set up and the towers and everything like that. Having hills, having debris is going to be a really kind of important part for some armies. And so you'll see more of that on the tabletop again, which I appreciate, because as much as I like ruins, it's nice to see some diversity in board setup. Woods are cool again. They benefit most units. They don't modify hit rolls or anything like that. Again, we're just dealing with cover saves again. We're just dealing with modifying armor saves. So it's functionally similar to how it was in older editions. You get the benefit of cover if you're in or behind the woods. You can fire out of the woods unhindered, but if you're trying to shoot into or through it, then you're running into problems. The exception to this is that there are 2 types of units that don't get cover from woods. Aircraft and towering units. Towering is a new keyword. Presumably it just means tall, right? So think about your knights, for example. And so if they're really big, they stick out of the woods, you can still pew pew them, I guess. Makes sense. But it's unknown, what the threshold for towering is. I'm assuming that it's going to be things that are like Riptide size and larger. That's kind of my assumption. Smaller things like Sentinels, Wraith Lords. I guess maybe the current. I say new. I would think new Wraith Lord, but that's it's been a while since that kit is out. Maybe that would be towering too. But things like that. My guess is that they would still probably be okay in a woods. But those larger models, that are knight or knight adjacent probably are the things that are going to be towering and not benefit from that. And the fact that this is a new keyword that probably, has some mechanics outside of this, but largely is meant to, identify that these are the types of units that just don't benefit from being in woods. That's awesome, right? The fact that this keyword is meant to specifically pull out tall units, provides an intuitive separation of the cover mechanic from wounds. There were, some models that, had lots of wounds or something like that, had rules applied to them just because of their wound count, even if they were relatively small. This provides separation from cover mechanics from other rule sets based on physical stature, not just based on wound count, which is nice. And then we have the final preview, which was ruins, which again are probably the most historically important terrain type in 40k. And ruins are awesome in 10th edition 40k. So they're still obscuring. One of the best things about 9th edition was the way obscuring worked, right? The fact that you couldn't just shoot through a tiny little pinhole window, that's still part of the rules, right? So even though obscuring as a keyword is gone, ruins still maintain that functionality. You can't fire through them, with the exception of aircraft and towering units. Those things are big enough or high enough in the air, you can still target them if you can see them. Your line of sight is determined normally there. So if they are still blocked by something, you can't see them. It's not an abstraction. It's what you can see is what you can shoot in those cases. And so you can't fire through ruins. You can only fire in or out of them. And the obscuring effect is based on the footprint. It's no longer based on height requirements. So even if you have a little tiny wall, that still is obscuring. We don't have the height requirement anymore, which I appreciate because that just added, you got into these situations where it's like, well, is that obscuring? Is it not? Okay, I have to measure. No, just forget that, right? That was needlessly complicated for the edition. So no height requirement. It's just based on the footprint. Sweet. Good move, G-dubs. Any model within the ruin gets cover. It's not restricted by unit type. So it's not just infantry or anything like that. It's not like bikes can't benefit from cover inside ruins or that, unless there's some other rule that says that, bikes just can't enter ruins or something. But as far as it's presented here, it's not restricted by unit type at all. So any type of model, if they're in the ruin, gets benefit. And that means that ruins are even more important, in that regard than they were before, because there's no restrictions. So anyone can use it. Aircraft and towering models still can get cover if they're behind the ruin, right? Their line of sight is determined normally. So if they're obscured, lowercase o, I guess, if your line of sight is inhibited partially by the ruin, presumably they still get cover, because if you're within or behind the ruin, you get the benefit of cover. Then the other really cool thing about ruins is this plunging fire rule. It says each time a model that is wholly within the terrain feature makes a ranged attack, if that model is 6 inches or more vertically from the ground, and every model in the target unit is at ground level, you improve the AP of that attack by 1. So it doesn't apply if the target is off the ground, which is interesting, right? If you had a height difference of 6 inches between two models, but both of them were off the ground, this wouldn't come into effect. It only applies if the target is at ground level, which they haven't actually defined here. There's a good question about, what if you have a ruin that is on top of a hill? Is the model, if there's a model at the base of that ruin on top of the hill, can you still use plunging fire? My assumption would be yes, but that's not clearly stated here. So there's probably a little bit of fine-tuning that needs to go into that in terms of defining what ground level is. And it doesn't seem like it's something that they've defined because it's not capitalized or anything like that. So yeah, but just using kind of common sense, maybe, we could assume that it would still apply there. But it doesn't apply if you have like a really cool board that, has lots of different levels of ruins or something like that, right? It's only if they're on the ground, which is an important caveat to remember. This brings a welcome return of height mechanics. There have been editions in the past, I want to say like 3rd, 4th edition, maybe it was 5th, had basically rules where if you were taller or higher up than an opponent, you got some benefits, right? Like ignoring cover or whatever. And that's really cool to see that come back. I like that. That's a very kind of kill teamy kind of feel to it, that just, I think, makes sense. And so this is a nice way that they're kind of reintroducing ignores cover in a very accessible way. So if you're improving the AP by 1, you can negate other people's cover, right? So you can just automatically ignore cover by getting this, or if they don't benefit from cover, you get increased AP, just, flat out, which makes sense. If you're, higher up, you're going to be able to target maybe the weaker parts of their armor or whatever. So that's good. It also counteracts kind of their reduced AP design mechanic, right? That that if Games Workshop is saying, okay, we're going to reduce the AP of most weapons, but we are also going to provide more opportunities for the AP to be improved via this plunging fire rule, right? So it makes sense, right? If they're reducing the AP of a bunch of weapons, but allowing you to increase the AP of your weapons by just being in ruins, that makes sense. If they kept the AP where it was at and added plunging fire, that would probably go too far the other way. So I like this. It's smart. It makes sense that they're, taking in one place and putting in another, making things accessible. I like it. It's cool. It's thematic. And again, this in particular, meaning the ruins rules, really does exemplify that simplified but not simple mantra. And so we're bringing it full circle here. I am super excited about how clean and flavorful these rules are. I think it's going to make for great games, and I can't wait to play 10th edition just looking at this. It's awesome. So let me know what you think in the comments below. Am I full of it? Do you agree? Either way, let's have a conversation. And as always, thanks for watching and happy wargaming. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. If you want to pick up one of the Invasive Wargaming models before they become unavailable, head on over to the Invasive Wargaming Etsy store in the description below. Also, if you like this video, you should know that it is made possible by my kind sponsor, the Magnet Baron, as well as the excellent folks over on Patreon. If you want to support the channel, you can certainly hop on over there and join our community. Special thanks to Shifty, Durza, Everett Keller, Stephen Cowan, Jack Inacker, Jared Egler, and Scott Heater.